Welcome to the Surviving Opioids Beyond an Epidemic Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Simone. I'm a doctor of pharmacy, certified dietary supplement advisor, founder of Reaction Recovery, as well as a person in long-term recovery from opioid addiction. This show is about life beyond opioid addiction, life beyond this epidemic. We talk about the opioid crisis as it looks on the ground level, and we hear about stories of folks thriving on the other side of the chaos. I'll be speaking with guests who have lived through, experienced, or been working alongside folks down in the trenches. These lived experiences are raw, they're honest, and you're going to get incredible perspectives and conversations from a diverse group of people. This show is for anyone interested in opioid addiction and interested to hear that although we have lost hundreds of thousands of people in the past decade, we also do recover. If you want to be notified of new episodes, hit the subscribe button in the bottom right, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. Today's guest for the show's first episode is Yeshaia Blakeney. Yeshaia is an addiction expert with 17 years experience working in substance abuse and mental health. Sober since age 21, Yeshaia has a deep understanding of the youth addiction and recovery process and works well with people for whom 12-step programs have been ineffective or are looking for an unorthodox approach. Aware that lasting recovery has a spiritual dimension, Yeshaia helps folks build a customized path towards healing that best fits their personal senses of identity. Yeshaia, it's great to have you on. I'm very excited to be speaking with you face to face. You have an incredible way of breaking down and articulating just these very complex, nuanced, and often pretty contentious areas of recovery. And I know that the listeners will love to hear your perspective on opioid addiction in particular. So good morning.
Thanks for having me. Super appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem at all. So, thank you for being the guinea pig, for a new show here. Okay, we'll see if I can, figure out how to do all this podcast stuff. You and I actually crossed paths in person 8 years ago. It was at a treatment facility in West LA. Me as a client, you as a group facilitator. A little bit of a background about me for the listeners. Since this is our first show. May 31st, 2013, I was actually court ordered to do 90 days inpatient. Okay, so that was almost exactly 8 years ago. This is being recorded on May 27th here. I wasn't happy about it, obviously, but I did it. I was actually coming off of close to 1,200 milligrams of oxycodone per day, and I remember all these numbers, because I used to. It was very meticulously would kind of count this stuff. I was taking 30 milligram oxycodones, 12 Vicodin, 12 Norco, and then Xanax, Soma, Adderall, and all that stuff was basically taken away at once. And it was just the most unbelievable experience in my life. Everything that I thought I knew kind of collapsed in a moment's time, and the whole experience was really more traumatic, I think, than I could have possibly imagined. Now looking back, I believe that I dissociated for a whole lot of it because I was living in this one house for 30 days, and I barely have any memories of it, really. But I remember you. Okay, you were one of those first voices that I could hear, so to speak. Quote unquote hear. So when considering a podcast, starting a podcast, talking through this opioid epidemic, the good, the bad, and the ugly, I thought of you right away. So I guess my first question to you is, do you remember me?
I don't. I mean, I remember you because we've connected a little bit online,
yeah.
But in terms of the interaction, no.
Yeah.
No, I remember the face, but not our interactions. But
yeah.
I remember the group. It was a really pleasurable group to run. So it was pretty awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually saw a picture, because the memories, sort of pop up, and then we had this one panoramic picture of that group sitting in the back, and at one point it was a pretty small group. There was about 9 people, and 5 of those 9 have since passed away.
Whoa.
And it's
wow.
It's just one of those things, and I guess I kind of working in this business in this industry. I'm sure that you see it all the time. I was not aware of that kind of just how lethal it was out of the gate. Anyway, I knew how painful withdrawal was, and I tried to do that for 10 years on my own. So I had a very intimate relationship with opioid withdrawal. But in terms of I really believe that, as soon as you got somebody detox, I mean, that was the only real challenge, is just getting people off this stuff, but once you get them off, then they're going to be fine. And, that certainly hasn't been my experience. So one of the first things, though, that I remember you talking about specifically was the importance of a strong foundation, and just the types of therapies and guidance that we receive in the beginning. It can be so important. And, I remember that you made this analogy, and I still use this today. You said something to the effect of like, if you were to stab like a tree with a knife, like it might do like a little bit of damage, but the tree's going to repair itself. But if you take that same knife and stab a seedling, you are permanently changing the course of that organism's life.
Well, yeah, I remember that. I still use that. You actually made the metaphor a lot better. Mine was much simpler, but
yeah, I got the idea basically right. Is that?
Yeah, that was better than mine. So yeah.
That's what my memory stored from that whole. And again, I mean, I was in this Ativan haze for like a week and a half, but somehow that sunk in, and I heard it.
Yeah, I was talking about trauma and adaptation, and so the metaphor is, a tree growing straight is, happy, healthy, and whole, what we're all shooting for. But if something comes, a stab, an impact of some kind that stops the trajectory, that can't be processed by the person, kid, whatever it is, it just adapts and goes around. But it doesn't know that it's done that, because that's its only sort of life path. And then, the tree starts bumping into things because it's got this tumor on the side of it, and goes, what am I bumping into? And the bumping into is the metaphor for, why am I using drugs? Why can't I stay in a relationship? Why can't I do all this other stuff? And it was just a way to understand that, much of what we experience and are wrestling with psychologically, spiritually, are ways in which we adapted to our environment when we were younger, having to do with big T and little t trauma, traumatic dynamics, et cetera. And then we self-medicate, because we got this crook, or stab wound, that's sort of the idea.
Yeah. Wow. What's interesting too, you just saying that as you were doing that analogy, most likely you were talking about trauma. And trauma. Okay. So this did not, so I'm talking about something that happened 8 years ago. I did not stay sober. I've been sober for 5 years now. I got sober 2016. And I don't remember having heard the word trauma in regards to like addiction recovery until about like a year and a half, 2 years ago. All right. Which is it's so interesting. Like, there is no way. I was in this place for 90 days in a very good treatment facility. Afterwards, I came out, and I was pretty plugged into the 12 steps for a little bit there. And in terms of out in California, I was around a lot of good people, reading a lot of good books. There's no way that I did not hear, that I was not told about trauma, I guess I should say. It's one of those, like, when the pupil's ready, the teacher appears. And so that's interesting. Anyway, so like, what I want to start talking about, okay, you've been on the front lines of, for nearly like the entire opioid epidemic. I consider
the entire opioid epidemic. I remember seeing it start and trying to ring a bell. Yeah.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I mean, I consider it starting like right around the year 2000, kind of like when Oxycontin was really starting to kind of take root. Oxycontin came out around 97, took a couple of years for us to really figure out what was going on with that. And then I see it as there being two like major phases, in my opinion. The first was in 2009. Okay, that's when Oxycontin was reformulated. So it was now abuse resistant. You couldn't lick that coating off. And then a whole lot of people moved over to heroin. And then the second wave, from my perspective, was around 2014, 2015, as the whole carfentanil, synthetic opioid thing started kind of happening onto our shores. Do you feel, from your clinical experience, do you feel that the general prognosis on average for a full recovery is any better today than it was, 15 or 20 years ago when you first started?
No. No, I don't.
Anything?
Why don't I think that?
Why? Yeah, that's my next question.
I mean, I would probably say that across the board, not just with opiates,
Yeah.
but I would say the prognosis is not better across the board. I mean, well, I want to speak to a bias here. So, I'm speaking anecdotally, right? Not that I trust all the statistics out there. I don't, to be honest with you. But anecdotally, I work in treatment. And so when you ask me that question, it translates in my ear to, is treatment more effective, now with given the roughly the same kinds of problems, given the tools we have, et cetera, et cetera. So if we reformulate the question that way, I think I can answer it more accurately. And my answer is no. Largely because I think there's been a huge shift in, let's call it the level of development of the clients that we treat. And so the approach to recovery is different. I think that treatment kind of caters a lot more to clients than it used to in maybe kind of codependent and unhealthy ways, I would say.
Interesting.
And so there's a notion that sort of like certain therapeutic modalities and, the right setting is going to get you sober, which everybody knows is not true. I mean, it's what you do, in the setting and the work that you put in and, and maybe some luck and some, blessing. I don't know all the ingredients, but, it surely isn't the therapeutic modality that gets you better. I'm not saying that never happens. But that is not, the largest agent of change for people in recovery, by and large. So I think that as treatment has shifted to a sort of a therapeutic model, which it really didn't used to be. I mean, it used to be treatment was a bunch of KDACs, or basically paraprofessionals who had a bunch of years sober in community settings. You might or might not have a therapist, depending on the treatment center you went to, but therapy wasn't the core of it, really. And
it's kind of more like 12-step basis. Is that what you mean by folks that haven't had a couple years?
I mean, still largely 12-step based, but it was 12-step based, but to me that wasn't the point. The point was the way that the programs were structured. They were structured to say, here's what you need to do, to get clean. It was some basic stuff: people, places, things, being willing to sacrifice, certain, let's call them ego, self-desires, being willing to stay in treatment for a very long time, being willing to get a get-well job, being willing to, all of the sort of structural stuff to me, which is the cultural and structural stuff in recovery, which is, for me, it's 80%, you know what I mean? That's 80% of the deal. And because of, I think, insurance and a bunch of reasons we could or could not get into, the therapeutic dimension of treatment has pretty much taken over. And I find that fascinating because, addiction has been pretty much known to be pretty immune to therapy for, for 100 years or so. I mean, that's why AA started. Right. And I'm not a huge 12-step fundamentalist. I'm not here to pitch AA, although I consider myself a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. But I mean, it was never thought that a quote unquote real alcoholic or real opioid addict could start doing a lot of therapy and that would get them better. Yeah. I mean, that was just never a model that anybody said made sense. It's a nice marketing model, for a lot of programs to say, we're going to give you, 5 to 6 therapy sessions a week, and that's going to get you clean. I mean, maybe, but, not in my experience.
Yeah.
So I think treatment is less effective. It seems to me Suboxone is better than methadone. So, people that are on long-term Suboxone maintenance.
Well, hold on. I'm actually going to stop you right there because I do want to get into that. Because that is definitely an area that I want to ask you about specifically. I feel like your perspective on this. One of the things that I love about you too, and just watching, I follow you on Instagram. And I watch all of your IGTV videos. Thanks, I don't know why every one of yours doesn't have like 1 billion views. I mean, you're
the guy who's watching it.
They are all spot on. Everything, like my only complaint about them is that they're 3 minutes instead of 30 minutes on each topic. I could hear you sit there and just go off on it. They're really, really good. But you get into these, these kind of heated, contentious topics. I mean, like recovery, I say it all the time, if you have a chronic disease state or a condition or a disorder with a high incidence and very, very low success rates, of course you're going to have controversy. How could you not have controversy? How do you feel that COVID has impacted the prognosis? I know I heard you talk for a couple of minutes about it. Like when somebody entered treatment, last March or April, and then they left treatment in say June or July of 2020, how confident were you that this individual was entering into a community that was well equipped to support their recovery?
It's a great question. I mean, I was just talking to a buddy of mine who owns a sober living. He's worked in the field 15 years. And, one of the things about treatment, if you work in treatment, I'm in for-profit treatment, which is different than, charity treatment, but either way, you're running into, I don't know, 60 to 80% of the population that doesn't want to be there.
Yeah.
And so there's a huge sort of lack of willingness of people coming in because people have been coerced into treatment. Like you were coerced into treatment by the court. I was coerced into treatment, parents, judges, circumstances, spouses. There's huge coercive factors. Mm-hmm. So one of the real benefits to COVID was the excuses that people have of the things they need to do and why they can't come to treatment or why they need this pass or why they need to graduate early all went away. There's nothing to do. Everybody was on lockdown, not just you at the treatment program. So that was awesome.
See, that's why I'm asking you. I never actually considered that. Is like, that makes so much sense. Yeah. That like you were taking that away from people, somebody, I have to go and I don't know, whatever. I
got a week sober. I got to go back into my job. It's like,
exactly.
Detox.
Oh, wow. So, okay. So
that was a huge benefit.
That would be an example where it's an advantage, for at least you guys, you can kind of resist that pull.
Another advantage was a sense of camaraderie that both the staff and the clients were going through an unknown period together. I mean, we stayed in person. So, we were like still a community, like, figuring it out, and that sense of camaraderie is a huge deal. I mean, when I talk about cultural and structural and community components of treatment, I think that's almost everything. Yeah. And so that sense of camaraderie is not to be underestimated as an agent of change. Where I think there were negatives, which I think we're kind of through now in LA, was in transition, and so people who in our program, you get 3 months, you look for work generally, and you start working, 4 or 5 months in. And for people that were, let's quote unquote, failure to launch, meaning people who hadn't really worked or really done anything, it was very difficult to try to kind of get a job. And so treatment burnout, you're still coming to groups, you don't have the kind of structure, you can't volunteer anywhere, you can't get a job at Ralph's, so that has sort of, even still, our community still like coming back to its normal flow, because it got clogged up, let's say, for people that came 7-8 months ago and that are now going to work, and stuff like that. But overall, I might think we had the best recovery year we've had. I mean, it's kind of a trip, actually.
Yeah. I such a great, kind of take on it, from that perspective. Yeah, that I'm not in that setting looking at it from there. I'm more looking at it from the vantage point of, maybe after somebody comes out, these different fellowships, organizations, communities in person that you're going to try to kind of hit the ground running. A lot of that stuff can get disrupted. Now, I will, say, like, from personal experience, about a week into this thing. All right. So like the end of March, we had like an outdoor home group around my, with kind of my group, and that thing was running the entire time. So we were never, and that was running, 3 or 4 days a week. I mean, everybody was very cautious.
Sure. Like
the whole time, but at first, very, very cautious, but it was never enough to and we tried Zoom for like a week, and we were just like, this is just, I found myself like, like I was on Zoom and I would, kind of close the camera and I'd be like checking my Instagram. And I'm thinking like, what am I? This is just craziness.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So there's different perspectives, right? I mean, I'm giving you my experience in our treatment program, right? In general, I mean, I think in general, Zoom meetings are very difficult for a lot of people, especially new people. Not to say that there aren't benefits, because I think the biggest resistance people have to meetings, it's not the one they speak about, but it's the one, to me, that's real, is they're uncomfortable joining a group. And so, they might say higher power, they might say, whatever, but in the end, I think people are uncomfortable to walk into a group of people they don't know. And that's, one of the bigger deals. Sorry. And so for some people, maybe it's a stepping stone, like, oh, it's not as, intimate, therefore I'm a little more comfortable. But in general, I think it's more difficult. Obviously, COVID exacerbated everybody's anxiety. And every time I had a sniffly nose, what's going to happen to the world? Everybody went through some weird head trip, some people, more severe than others. And so do I think it was sort of good for the overall recovering community outside of treatment? No. But it did probably expose a lot of mental health and substance abuse fragility that you wouldn't see until something happens. So a lot of people have a problem that they're managing, relatively well, as long as the structure of their life changes. But as soon as there's a divorce or they lose their job or they retire, it's like, wow, you see what was holding them together was that external structure, and internally they had, some fragility. So I think that that's what got exposed in the population at large, because most people that have a substance abuse problem never come to treatment and never go to an AA meeting.
Right.
So we have to remember that there's, millions upon millions of people that manage their situation enough, that they're not ever known as, somebody who needs recovery in any real way. That's the majority. I don't think about that as somebody who works in treatment very often, but I know that to be true.
Yeah. And I think especially with alcohol in particular, at least like this past year, it really seems kind of all those like sub-therapeutic, well, even now that we have the alcohol use disorder spectrum, and like a lot of those folks, I guess, that are coming maybe to your treatment center, I would assume that they're scoring high, that they're in the more severe AUD range. But I do feel that probably over this year, a lot of people who were in the mild to moderate range might have bumped up 1 or 2 ticks.
100%. 100%. Yeah. It's important to not think about somebody's relationship to a substance in isolation, that, people are seeking balance, right? In general, some kind of homeostasis in our lives. And we're trying to manage and control our lives to hold some balance and homeostasis. So even when you're strung out, you have a sort of a system of your life that you're trying to hold together. Like, I got to get this money tomorrow so I could do this thing and hopefully not get arrested and make sure I got the, and so, as soon as something comes along that kind of, messes up the systemic balance of your life, stuff starts moving around, and definitely the pandemic did that for everybody, in all kinds of ways.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with that take. Okay. So kind of moving on into I do want to talk a little bit about harm reduction. You were starting to kind of get into it a bit. So there has been this large push into harm reduction strategies. I'm on board with a lot of them. Like they make sense and seem predictable anyway, given the fatalities, given the deaths. Deaths have a tendency.
I don't want my kids dying.
Exactly. Deaths have a tendency of catching the public's attention. We've put a lot of money into like acute care treatment over the decades, but the problem, like you were even talking about, does seem to be getting worse. So now it seems like a lot of the resources are getting redirected, maybe towards mitigating the problem, trying to reduce the suffering, so to speak.
Sure.
For example, like decriminalizing some of these lower level drug offenses, marijuana has become legalized, I think pretty much everywhere now, right?
Not in every state, but
not everywhere, but it's getting there. Maybe some others in the future. Kind of recently, some of these major celebrities, have talked about some moderation strategies, with opioid addictions in terms of marijuana. The kind of California sober thing has been pretty popular over the last month of, in terms of like being in the media, everybody's weighing in on it. How do you feel that this more, progressive movement has impacted or will impact the likelihood that an opioid, specifically an opioid addicted person will ultimately fully recover? And I kind of wanted you to stay on marijuana for a second, because I will get into the other maintenance therapies in a follow-up question.
Yeah. Okay. So specifically around marijuana is what you're asking, and then we could get into the other.
Yeah.
I feel it was inevitable, in North America, the 12-step lens, and I'm a huge advocate of 12-step. I think I have 20 videos advocating for the 12 steps. So it's weird that I say this, but the the 12-step lens has been the dominant in the discourse for a long time. And the 12-step lens is factually not correct in a lot of ways. It's old. And so, is it true that somebody who is a quote unquote real alcoholic, that every single person who is a real alcoholic can never have a drink again and drink normally? And the answer is, of course, that's not true.
Yeah.
Of course, there are people out there who are horrible, raging alcoholics that have a glass. Is it a lot? No. Is it less than 1%? I don't know. But it's not 100% true.
Yeah,
is it 100% true that an opiate addict can never have a drink? Of course not. I know ex-heroin addicts that got sober in the 70s that are normal and married with, is it incredibly risky? So because that is such and it's not even AA, frankly. It's the interpretation that the people in AA have about the program, applying it to other drugs and stuff like that. You know what I mean? And so it was pretty inevitable because there are people who, stopped using heroin, smoked weed, and never used heroin again. There are probably more people who, at least went to treatment, were using heroin, smoked weed, started drinking, and then started doing heroin again. Right. I mean, it's true. You know what I mean? Let's be honest. But was that because they smoke weed? Yeah. I mean, who knows? It's such a complex problem. I think it was pretty inevitable. In terms of the California sober thing, it's a she's a celebrity that I know has been to treatment locally a lot, and I think was kind of taken advantage of, to be honest, in the recovering community. With some treatment programs, and started speaking out loud. And to me, sometimes there's such a thing as just too much transparency.
Yeah.
Like, we don't need to know everybody's recovery path in fine detail. Like, we don't need to know that she smokes weed or drink. She might need to know that, her close circle and people, but do we all need to know everything about everybody's, no, not really. But this is the world we live in, where everything is sort of overexposed. Is California sober some model of staying clean? No, it's not a model of staying clean. It's a person's temporary personal experience that might or might not work for them. I obviously hope it works. In terms of how that fits into harm reduction, you've seen my video. So my sense is that by the strict definition, abstinence-based recovery meaning I don't drink, I don't do any quote unquote drugs, meaning weed, blah, blah, et cetera, will be a much smaller part of people's general recovery path within the next 5 to 10 years. And when I say much smaller, I think, less than 20%.
Oh, wow. So you think less than 20% who identify themselves as being in recovery will be this kind of quote unquote, fully abstinent, like the way that maybe a lot of the
totally. Even right now, I would beg to say, depending on where you draw the lines of, abstinent, I would say even right now, probably, at least in LA, some decent percentage of people are doing things they're not necessarily speaking about publicly. And so, and I think that makes sense. It's the same as, the analogy that I use in my video is diet, and like, there are certain substances, just like in diet, that like everybody should basically stay away from. You've got your saturated fats and your processed sugars. It's like, don't do it. You know what I mean? And that's your crack, your heroin, your methamphetamine. There's a list there of stuff that is almost your opiates. Almost never beneficial, right? Then there's these ones in the middle, which even society is saying, hey, these are kind of okay, like marijuana and alcohol. That's like your kind of red meat or whatever, for some people, depending on your body composition, right? And then you have these substances over here, which used to be illegal substances that are now thought of as medicinal, possibly, right? MDMA is going to be used for trauma, psilocybin, ayahuasca. And so it doesn't necessarily, I don't think that the abstinence-based model is going to survive psilocybin being maybe the highest prescribed antidepressant and anti-anxiety medication that exists. I think within 8 years, that'll be the case.
Oh, wow. That's your prediction with that one? Yeah.
Yeah. It'll be legal in 2.5.
Yeah.
It's a better antidepressant than all of the antidepressants, not in every case, but in most. There's a big study that just came out.
Yeah.
The negative side effects are Very little. It's natural, it comes from the ground. It can create empathy, focus. I mean, it's not addictive. I mean, let's be honest, right? Not that people can't abuse it, but it's not an addictive substance.
Not in the sense of the other guys. Well, my prediction has been, and I've been making this for the last maybe year and a half, 2 years, is that over the next 10 to 15 years, I do believe that SSRIs are going to move out of popularity in terms of that first line treatment. I did not know what it was going to be. I really could not. This was, before I was even hearing a lot about psilocybin. I really did not know what, but just kind of following the paths and the cycles of a lot of these pharmaceuticals. That's just the feeling that I was getting from that class. And I kind of feel like it's in terms of them being this, this kind of all-encompassing, cure-all. That has sort of failed to materialize. Certainly they can help a lot of people, but in terms of them being like prescribed to everybody like they are now, I think that peaked a couple of years ago. And I think in 10 to 15 years, they're not going to be first line anymore.
Yeah. Well, and let's be totally clear. If you look at psilocybin or MDMA, obviously MDMA is trickier in some ways, but nonetheless, it's a very different modality than giving somebody a pill to treat symptoms. I mean, if somebody's doing a large, monitored dose of psilocybin set and setting, you're doing your therapy on the psilocybin. It's not trying to treat the symptom.
Yeah.
Right. If somebody's microdosing and meditating or doing yoga to, get some insight into their inner life, that's very different than Prozac or Zoloft, which is attempting to, modify certain receptors to stop whatever the hell's happening in depression, or anxiety. So, in my mind, and I can't believe people don't talk about this that much. I've spoken at conferences and stuff about it because I'm like, this is going to change how we view recovery entirely. We've already got ketamine on board in a lot of treatment programs for depression. They're going to be bringing MDMA as possibly the most helpful treatment for PTSD, and not even possibly right now. Statistically, it is. And they're bringing in psilocybin. I mean, how does that work with abstinence-based treatment?
I know, and a lot of it too. I think like the indoctrination of the abstinence-based programs with regards to 12-step, because those are the most common. So, like, let me speak from experience. For me, I was taking all those things that I mentioned. Okay, so I was coming in and I was physically, psychologically, chemically dependent on opioids, benzos, muscle relaxers, and stimulants. And
tough combo.
And they were stopped all at once. And then not only were they stopped, there was nobody was consulting me about this. Nobody was saying, like, do you think, how about the stimulant? Should we keep that one? Should we? It's like they were all taken away, and it was horrible. Now, so I didn't stay sober at first, and actually 2015 was the worst year of my life. I didn't have access to the pharmaceuticals anymore. It was heroin and meth, and it was as bad as I could have possibly expected that my life could have been. Was that year? Now, was that because abstinence was forced upon me? I don't know. But now that I have been, fully abstinent for these 5 years here, that has been completely indoctrinated in me. Last year, so exactly like 1 year ago, I was in a horrible car accident.
Wow.
I was knocked out for a period of time. I broke my left ankle, all the toes in my right foot. I couldn't walk for a couple months. It was very bad. But I needed surgery for the first time in my life, not just first time in recovery, first time in my life. And I didn't take any opioids. I didn't take any. And it was shy. It was brutal. It was the most painful. I mean, I'm 48 hours into this after like the nerve block from the surgery wore off, and I'm like, it's 3:00 in the morning. I'm like staring up at the ceiling, just thinking like, what am I doing? What am I? Is this? Am I? Am I reducing the harm to myself by not introducing opioids, or am I being a masochist, not allowing pain medicine when I have actual pain? So, I mean, that is something that I really had to deal with. And I talked about it, but I always say, I don't recommend that to anybody. I mean, everybody has to go through their own deal with that.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I don't have a grudge at all towards abstinence-based sobriety. I mean, quite the opposite, it's the ideal. I mean, like my abstinence-based sobriety has been by far the best trip of my life. You know, the challenge with recovery and treatment is everybody is so freaking different. You know, and so when we talk about addicts or opioid addicts, it's like that's not a really great category. You know, it's like there's a category like people who eat carrots. It's like, well, that doesn't really tell me much about somebody. You know what I'm saying?
I'm one of them.
You know, yeah, like me too. I eat carrots, you know. And so, you know, we're always misspeaking or speaking in such general ways when we're talking about addiction and recovery. You know, like one of the things I thought about really early on, I don't want to say really early on, so probably when I was like, 10 years sober or something like that, was I realized that our experience, like those of us that have been in 12-step programs, that have been in recovery communities, that what we see and experience of people relapsing is totally biased. And here's just an easy, quick mental way to think about that. I think there's a group of people that come into recovery that chronically relapse. And let's just, for argument's sake, call that 30%. They relapse more than twice and then just keep relapsing. And actually, there's some validity to the fact that that's the case, that there are sort of different trajectories of recovery, different people with different problems that are coming in. So there's some group of people that has a really, really hard time getting clean, period. And some of them never get clean, but they're so visible. You know what I mean? It's like you see them in and out. They come back and they go, oh, well, I went to go experiment. I got some. And it's like, wow, over and over again as newcomers, And so we see that and it's so scary. We think that's everybody. Do you know what I mean? Then there's, let's call it, this is a thought experiment, another 30% of people that might relapse, 2 or 3 times over the course of a 25-year, sobriety trajectory. Sometimes early on, sometimes they're spread out and they come back and they have functional lives and things don't fall apart. Then you have a group of people that actually heal. They go to AA meetings for a while and then you just don't see them again. You don't know what the hell happened to them. But a lot of them, became Buddhists or just stayed sober or were, doing controlled drinking and it worked, but you would never see them again because they're not at the meeting.
Yeah.
And so because that's the way that we interface and we tend to focus our attention on this group over here, you know what I mean? That's always going to treatment and always, in and out of the meetings, we tend to think that's everybody. But it's not, people have very different trajectories. And so, yeah, if I'm in that 30% and I injure my leg, I'm not touching opiates. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't matter if my wife's watching it. Like, I'm such a bad opiate addict.
Yeah.
And I had such bad experiences that, I'd rather go through the pain if I can. If I'm in that third group, I'm not even thinking about it. Of course I'm taking, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And that's for each person to kind of figure out. Unfortunately, that first group thinks they're in the third group every time.
Right, exactly. I was going to say that.
The
first group is not aware that they are the first group.
They always think they could do it one more time.
Yeah. That's a really great explanation of it. I don't know, because the way that I always talk about opioids is that it was a love affair, because I can never really think about or think of better words to describe it than that.
Sure.
It felt like a love affair. And then, so for me, especially going through this, I'm thinking, no matter how bad it is just physical pain. It might be horrible. And it was. And, but anyway, okay. So kind of moving on.
But sorry, before you move on. So even you is like a great example. Like when you early on talked just a little bit about your using, I thought in my head, oh, you're one of those, like, oh, I measure out this much, like, like, that in the personality type realm, you're incredibly conscientious, right? And so, which means I can get some insight into what it's like internally for you. Who's like maybe a conscientious, discipline. Maybe there's some rigidity in the thought structure. A lot of positives to that, some difficulties, and opiates and alcohol are 2 things that allow people to really kind of let go of control.
Yeah,
it's like, oh. Right. But that's a certain type. Most opiate addicts aren't that cautious and careful.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so, but I know that type, you know what I mean? And their path to recovery and how, right, is a little bit different. They have better infrastructure because they can access discipline in some ways. They're thoughtful, they're detail oriented. I mean, I'm projecting on you. I don't know if all this is true, but it's my guess.
No, I mean, you're hitting the mark with me here.
Yeah. And so it's important to know that you're not the same as Bobby. You know what I mean? Who's eating out of the trash can, shooting up with, muddy, like, you guys have very different recovery paths, very different life trajectories. I mean, let's not act like everybody's the same.
Absolutely. And I mean, I have noticed this just even with little things that I see, even you say reading and exercise. Okay. Kind of two things that, when you were 2 years old, they're saying reading and exercise is good. At this point in your life, they're still saying it. Okay. So this is something that's never changed. It's like flossing. It's kind of one of those few things that we recommended 40 years ago, and we're still recommending today. But yet, how difficult is it to make like a reader out of a non-reader, or an exerciser out of a non-exerciser? And I have come to the understanding that there are just these personality differences, that it's not that one person is a bad person, or that they're lazy, or that they're they're unwilling. But I have noticed that frustration, especially with books, because there will be a book that just, I feel like it changes my life. And then I tell somebody, you got to read this book. And then I ask them like a month later and they didn't read it. And I want to shake them.
Yeah, I think it's totally true. And for me, that does relate to some of the conversation about kind of treatment. Is it better? Is it worse? I mean, I know that's not exactly what we were saying, but it's where my mind was going. And, one of the ways that you can turn a non-exerciser into an exerciser is to force them into boot camp for 6 months to 9 months. You know what I mean? It's funny, like there are people that make their bed meticulously and clean their room, and people that don't. But, once you go to prison, everybody does.
Yeah.
So it ain't like you can't. I mean, Fight Club has that great scene with Brad Pitt where he's like robbing the liquor store or whatever. And he goes, did you want to be a liquor store clerk when you grow up? He's like, no, I wanted to be in medicine. I'm going to school. And he gets his ID, puts a gun to his head, says, I'm coming back here in a month. And if you haven't finished your classes, I'm blowing your brain out, and like people can change, with the proper incentives, and, I don't know, for me as a man, it's there's a piece of that I see is very real. There's a piece of that, like when I got clean, the judge looked me in my eyes and said, if you don't stay clean, you're going to do 4 years in prison. Period. Like you have a suspended sentence. If I catch you, fucking out, that's 4 years. I didn't think I would be able to charm my way out of it.
Yeah.
That worked. And I went, oh, it worked, man. I was like, I'm not. Now that doesn't work for everybody.
Yeah.
There's a subsect of the population that doesn't, they'll say, well, just take me in now. It's a smaller bit of the population, but for a lot of people, like, if they're rational enough to know that they probably won't get away with getting loaded, which I was rational enough to go, I know how I would get down and I'm not going to be able to get over for, this entire time. I had to really take a look. That incentive was as helpful as any therapist I ever met.
Yeah. Wow. That's great. That makes me want to, I want to move on to my next kind of topic here with some more harm reduction. I'm going to kind of footnote that. And if we have time, like I want to come back to it. So
sure.
Anyway, so I do a lot of, different things with my recovery, as a lot of people do. One of them, is a group of us we'll go into a detox, once or twice a week. We have like an H&I panel where awesome. We go in there, we talk to, kind of bring the message of recovery in. It's been since I had about 30 days, really, I was going around with these guys, and it's been a big part of my recovery. One of the differences that I have noticed just over those years, specifically talking with the opioid addicted population, is that just over that kind of time period, it seems like most, if not all, of the patients in there, of the clients, are currently on, some type of opioid replacement therapy, whether it's buprenorphine-based products, whether it is methadone. And it seems like it's very rare nowadays for me to be speaking with somebody who came in for an opiate addiction and has opted to, for full abstinence.
Sure.
Now, certainly in terms of like reducing the likelihood of an immediate overdose, maintenance therapies are superior to full abstinence. Like I said, in the short term, like how it looks. But I guess my question to you is, how has it looked from your perspective with regard to long-term success? Like, do you think that these options are all reducing harms, or do you think that over time they could also be doing some harms.
Oh, of course. Come on. Of course. I mean, I of course think the latter.
Okay.
Everything is a trade-off, and this is what we don't want to own, so, and there's a lot of nuance in this conversation, right? There's using MAT for detox, there's using MAT for maintenance, and people like to make a big distinction about that. I think it is a big distinction, but let's just take the easy case, right? Which is, I'm generally an advocate for Suboxone for detox.
Yeah.
Okay, use 7 to 10 days. It's not a big deal. But even that, which is the easy case, is complex. Overall, does making detox easier benefit opiate addicts? I don't know. I mean, look, on the one hand, yeah, because they kind of want access to, it's less of a threshold to cross to get help. I know it's not going to be that painful, so I'm willing to go to detox. So on one hand, that's great. On the other hand, yeah, that could create a cycle of like, hey, detoxing is no big deal. Like, I'll get sober next month, So these things are all trade-offs. I think the biggest issue around Suboxone is the challenge of different levels of perspective, right? So like I said in one of my videos, if I'm the governor, of Ohio or something like that, I'm a huge Suboxone advocate. Well, why? Because I know how difficult individualized treatment for each and every person is and how expensive that is. And we don't have the resources to do it. I mean, maybe we have them, but we're not spending the resources to do it. And so I need to put a Band-Aid on the issue and try to help people not die. Okay. That's the perspective of a governor or, people who are creating policy. And that makes a lot of sense from that perspective. I would make the same decision. Given the resources that we have, what's the easiest way to stop the bleeding? Okay. I own a treatment program. So from a treatment perspective, we've had, I don't know, 300 to 500 people go through our program in the last, we're a small program, 6 years. Maybe more now, maybe 600. We've had two opiate maintenance clients, using Suboxone.
Wow. And that is like, that's surprising to me just to hear.
Tiny. Because there are, in my opinion, very specific instances where the benefit of that outweighs the cost. I'm a huge fan of Vivitrol. I mean, Vivitrol is kind of an awesome substance.
Same.
Right? It's like,
I was on Vivitrol for 3 months. I think that's a great drug. Yeah.
I mean, Vivitrol for a year, there's like, I haven't experienced an honest person saying there's a real side effect of Vivitrol at all.
Yeah. Even the stuff with the liver toxicity that they were initially thinking, a lot of those studies have now, found that it's a much, much, much more mild than they initially thought.
Not to mention that probably, I don't want to overstate it, let's call it 50%, but I don't know exactly, of the people that are coming in for opiates are actually polysubstance abusers that use opiates, which Suboxone doesn't do anything for, other than maybe reduce anxiety and reduce, craving for opiate. But still, they need to, they still do these other substances.
Yeah.
The other thing is, for somebody to be on Suboxone maintenance, they have to be relatively responsible. Meaning, first of all, you have to be able to do something basic, like take your medication every day on time.
Yeah.
And a lot of the clients we treat are not capable of that kind of management.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
And
like I said,
sell it or whatever else.
You're a disciplined guy. Even when you were using, you used in a disciplined way, right? So you might have been a good candidate for that. But a lot of these folks that we're treating are polysubstance abusers. I don't even want to be clean. Let me get some, and it's sort of just like, we're just adding one more variable into their addiction. The two people who have done it, one of them has been successful and one of them not. And I mean successful by every measure. I mean, the one that was successful, 5 years sober, in law school, doing fantastic.
Oh, wow.
Goes to meetings. I mean, relationships are thriving, the quality of everything, right? He's doing fantastic. And I'm open to those kind of experiments of working with that. But it was a lot of work. I mean, we were meeting about, how much and for how long. And, there was a lot of conversation and dialogue and support to walk somebody through a successful Suboxone maintenance plan. So even if it's Suboxone, it's like, you still need a lot of resources to help somebody,
Yeah. No, I agree. And just even at the point you were just mentioning with the meetings, because that comes up a lot too. A lot of these folks have had, bad experiences with the meetings, or maybe they,
Sure.
maybe they got honest for a second and then they were swarmed after the meeting and they were, encouraged to get off it. I mean, I'm happy to hear that in that the one of two example that you gave of the gentleman who is now thriving, that
Yeah.
he feels comfortable enough to kind of go into these places and not be,
It was a whole
initially
thing.
scared away of some of
That
the
was not
absence.
easy. I mean, that was a whole chunk of work on our part to help him navigate how to do that and to have an inner circle of people that he was, open to speaking to about it, that supported him, help him find a sponsor that wasn't dogmatic. I mean,
Yeah,
that's what I'm saying. It's a big chunk of work. None of this stuff
totally.
is easy. I mean, there ain't no magic bullets here, period.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I love that take on there. Okay. So I'm assuming that, you've seen hundreds or most likely thousands, folks with opioid addictions coming in and out of, treatment facilities over the
Yeah.
years here. Sometimes the
Yeah.
folks who look and sound like, they're really grasping this thing, they end up taking horrible turns for the worse.
Sure.
Sometimes, folks who come in and they're, angry and defiant and aggressive. And I was kind of this way. I was very, very angry that everything was taken away from me.
Sure.
Sometimes over time, seemingly inexplicably, these folks develop the desire and the willingness to actually get better. They, slowly start to reorient. It absolutely drives parents and loved ones crazy. That's for sure. Like when you're watching somebody during their treatment process or just listening to what they're saying. What do you think? Like, do you think that there's any kind of common like predictor or attitudes that seem to be good predictors of ultimate long-term recovery?
I wouldn't call them attitudes. I mean, maybe there is, but I guess I think about it more. I mean, my parents are developmental psychologists, and they studied addiction a lot. And we've had, I don't know, 10,000 hours of conversation about it. But they're huge predictors, so I'll give you an example. It's a guy named Lawrence Kohlberg who created the moral stages of development. The moral stages of development are looking at cross-culturally, cross-gender, how people think about issues of right and wrong. And it's stages 1 through 5, right? And you can measure them. I could ask you a few questions and probe and have a good sense of what stage you're at in terms of how you think about the choices you make in your life in the moral sphere. And most important choices are in the moral sphere. And so, if I come in and if I ask a young person, why shouldn't you get high? And they'd be like, well, shit, if I get high, my parents are going to, not let me move into an apartment, or, they're going to cut me off or whatever. And I need them, right? That's what we call in that model of stage 2 answer. So I know the consciously, the only reason why that person is staying clean is so that they don't get into trouble. Right. But that means as soon as they, think they can get away with it, they're going to get loaded.
Yeah.
And so that's a great predictor of if that person's that way when they're leaving, the punishment zone or the potential punishment zone.
Yeah.
I can predict almost 100% of the time that person's going to get loaded.
Yeah.
If the person says, I just can't do it to my parents anymore. Well, that's interesting. Stage 3. I care about these relationships, right? That means reduced narcissism, higher level of thinking relationally. Does that guarantee sobriety? No, but it's definitely on the way. If and we could go on and on through all of the stages. So to me, it's not as much an attitude as it's a certain level of development. And one of the tragedies with the opiate epidemic, I mean, we have a young guy here, he's 19, but developmentally he's like 16, maybe 14, and he's got a grown-up problem. I mean, opiates, being an opiate addict is an incredibly complex grown-up problem that kills half of the people that have it. And, only 20% of people or whatever recover, in the long term. I mean, I'm throwing those numbers out. People can look up whatever it is, but it's an incredibly serious problem. And for somebody who has the mind of a 14-year-old and, chronologically is only 19, that's a really tough deal.
Yeah.
And so in those situations, somebody else has to be in charge of that person because the 14-year-old ain't going to figure it out until they grow. And we don't like to own that, although I think Florida, maybe a couple other states just passed a law mandating long-term treatment for people in certain situations where a parent can kind of step in, even on a grown child, and say, hey, you're going to go to treatment for a year or 6 months. And that's a very tricky law.
I did not hear about that. Really?
Oh yeah.
But so if somebody is over the age of 18, if they're legally an adult, like a parent can say, "Do you have to stay in treatment?"
It's like a conservatorship, right?
Okay.
But let's be honest, right? Somebody's psychotic, they're out of their mind. The parent can step in and get a conservatorship. A parent or loved one or trustee, right? Can step in and say, this person's out of their mind. You know what I mean? They're going to kill themselves or harm somebody else.
Or even 5150 kind of thing. Is that what you mean?
There's a 5150, but you can actually get a long-term conservatorship.
Okay.
You can do it for a loved one, or if you're a trustee, you can actually suspend that person's legal rights sometimes for their entire life. And you're in charge of them. Why? Because they're not capable of being in charge of themselves, right? And so that mechanism has already existed in mental health. I don't know for how long, but decades, maybe longer. There are plenty of people, let's be straightforward, who are so entrenched in their addictions, they do not know what to do. I mean, they just should not be in charge of their own decisions. Now, that's complex legally. I'm not saying it's not. It's very risky. It's tricky. I'm sure there's going to be problems with it, but also understandable.
Yeah.
If I have some son or daughter who unfortunately is, shooting heroin for 7 years and running around the streets, man, I'm going to be so grateful that there's a law that I can force them into treatment and keep them there because they need it. They're
not going to be happy about it, but they might need it.
They're not happy now.
Exactly.
You shoot dope and living on the street.
It's a tough one. I'm interested to see how that is going to play out, long term.
It's going to be problematic, but we're in a shitty situation, so everything is problematic.
You're right. You're right. You're right. I mean, it's problematic having 100,000 people die from opioid overdose every year. And that's what's happening. That is most likely what the number is going to be over these past 12 months. So that kind of transitions me.
Well, let me just add one thing. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
So what do I, aside from the internal kind of personality, attitude, I mean, there are lots of things I could say. Curiosity. People who have a curious disposition do much better than people who don't, because curiosity is a sign of engagement and thinking and questioning. I mean, if I were to dive into your story, the time that you actually got sober, one of the things I find is you got real curious about what the hell was going on. And then you kind of went on the mission.
My hands on.
Everybody got curious. Everybody, if you're not curious, meaning there are people that go through my treatment program, they're here for 6 months, they never ask a question.
Yeah.
They only answer a question if you ask them. They don't ask a single, if you don't ask a single question and you don't know how to manage anything in your life, you're pretty disengaged. I'm not necessarily putting that on you. I think that's a certain state. So curiosity is a big one, but I won't get into all the different traits. But the one thing that I want to say that I think is the largest predictor of in terms of treatment success, maybe not recovery success, time. The length of time. I love a good sober living. I love a good sober living. I mean, I would love it to run the good numbers of the most expensive treatment program in the country, okay, against the, very well run $2,500. That's in LA, so it's more expensive. $2,500 a month, sober living.
Yeah.
What are the sobriety rates? You want to know the program that has the highest sobriety rate in Los Angeles?
What's that?
It's called. It's not mine, so this goes against my, my interest, but it's actually for my interest of helping people get better. It's called Awakening Recovery. It's a long-term sober living. You have to commit for a year to be there. It's 12-step, solid 12-step. It's probably not that much fun. People probably aren't always happy to be there.
Yeah.
It costs $0. It's in Beverlywood. And their success rate, I think at 2 years, but people can look this up. It's on their website. It is that. I know the owner, a lot of integrity. I believe everything they say. I think their success rate at 2 years is 90%.
Holy crap.
And that ain't Malibu, $80,000 a month.
Excellent.
You know what I mean? With 97 therapy sessions per week or whatever. You know what I'm saying? That's a trip. That's a trip.
Yeah, that is. I mean, I guess, it all depends upon the dynamics of those groups too. Like if you start, if this place has been kind of going on for a little bit and they have strong groups and those groups just kind of engulf that new person.
Man. That's it.
Yeah.
It's community, dude. I mean, we could dissect it all. It's super fascinating, like why certain people go here and why they go there and what the differences are. I mean, one of the beautiful things about recovery is you can't buy it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like you can't buy recovery. I mean, in fact, money can be a huge hindrance to your recovery. I'm gonna pay for a place in Florida where I go live on the beach, but they let me use my cell phone all the time, and they're going to cater to me, and they're never going to say anything that offends me the entire time, because they're going to meet me where I'm at, which is a therapeutic place. Well, we got to meet them where they're. They're going to meet me right in my addictive narcissism. Well, thank you very much. That's going to help me come back here in a month, after I burn out. And that's not on purpose. It's just people are confused, bad incentives, all this stuff.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's such a tough one. And you're right. We could go on for an hour just about that topic right there.
Yeah. We don't have to.
I mean, I would, this will set us up for the future. So, one of the things to kind of piggyback on like what you were talking about, with some of these laws where perhaps family members, at some point parents can eventually intervene. So even, just over the last year and a half, like of me being on social media, and I'm always talking with people in person and online communities. And I have a lot of parents who follow me online. I have a lot of, people will send me messages and kind of, stuff like that. Like a really common one that I get, is, so-and-so finally went to treatment. Okay. They completed 30 days. They seem to be doing great. Now they're back in the house and they're back using again. What should I do? And
oh God.
And my heart just breaks for it, because I do have a spouse who went through like a whole lot, with my kind of stuff. And so I'm always kind of split. It's always the codependent part of me wants to just, write that perfect answer that's going to solve the problems. And then, the 99% of me feels like complete powerlessness. Like there is nothing that I can do or say that's going to have any impact here. How do you usually counsel the parents who are living amid the chaos of an out of control active addiction, when the child is still living at the house?
What I find, and I get this, I'm a parent, I have 4 kids myself. So first of all, there's obviously no one answer, because radically different circumstances, I mean, everybody's situation is unique, right? And so I talk to the parent, first of all, trying to understand the dynamic and what's going on deeply. But a commonality that I find is parents often vacillate between being overly agreeable to their addict loved one, i.e. codependent in some sense, like, oh, I'm going to let my son or daughter back home after 30 days, even though the treatment program told me it's probably not a good idea. They need aftercare, because any treatment program worth its grade in salt is going to say, don't go back home after 30 days. But I'm going to take them home anyways, because they told me they want to take them home and they're going to do really well, And so parents, the general pattern I see is codependence, freak out, extreme action, and that dynamic has to change. I mean, the general dynamic has to change. I mean, the first thing you have to know is you can't save your kid, period. And so, once I own that I can't save my kid, the question is, at any given moment, what's the best way to support my kid? Do you know what I'm saying? And listen, I'm working with parents right now who they got really complex situations. They're stuck between a rock and a hard place, and their kid is a lethal user, and they feel safer when they're at home. And I probably feel safer when they're at home. And I don't want to tell them to kick them to the streets, but I don't want to. And they run away from detox if you drop them off. And there's not good answers to that situation. There's just a choice you make, and you pray that it goes right. You know what I mean? I mean, every treatment professional is going to say, get it back to treatment, which, if you can, great. You know what I mean? And that's no guarantee either. If it's an adult, they can just walk right out of treatment, Okay, send them out of town to treatment. Okay, send them, hopefully they'll get arrested.
I know. Tough calls. It is such a tough one, especially, so I guess I'm kind of running on the assumption, like in this example, that the person is not willing to go back to treatment or does not want to go, and they're in their basement and now they're smoking crack again.
I'll say this in terms of drawing the firm boundary. You can't be in my house while you get loaded. Again, it goes back to the different types of people. For a huge percentage of people, they're not going to be homeless or couch surf for more than a few days. That's a certain group, but that's one of the questions I ask people when they call me. I'm like, how's your kid feel about being homeless? Because I want to know that information. Like if they're comfortable being homeless, drawing that boundary is not that helpful. You know what I mean?
That's a really good point.
So there's all of that assessment that you kind of have to do. The kid currently who I'm helping in the family, he's not comfortable being homeless, but the dad's not comfortable with those 2 days that it's going to take for him to come back. And a lot of the time, that firm boundary for the 2 days for the person that's not comfortable being homeless is all it takes to get them into treatment. Okay. And then you just can't let them back home. And my whole thing about recovery for young people is once you go to treatment, you should never go home.
Yeah.
Don't go home.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Don't go back to mom and dad's. Don't go back to, you know what I mean? Once you're in treatment, that's your launch pad into life and recovery. You know what I mean?
I agree with that, actually. And I'll hear from a lot of people too. Like I remember just, even over the years, working with guys in 12-step groups, like a lot of the, something that I would hear a lot is they say, no, like my parents don't even drink. We don't even have alcohol in the house. It's a safe place to be. And it's been my experience that, I mean, of course, if there's active addiction in your house, that's a problem. But it seems like that does not have anything to do with
the dynamic.
Yeah, it's a dynamic, right?
I mean, we use the same word. When we talk about drug addicts, we talk about them as dependent. Right? Now, that's the kind of wound, right? The wound needs to become dependent on something to be okay. Now, a lot of therapists, and I'll call this true enough, and I think you're interested in this topic, think that, at the root of it all is attachment trauma.
Yeah.
And so therefore, the dynamic in relationship to a child and a parent and going back to that environment, where there's some kind of disturbed attachment that maybe is the root of your addiction, maybe not, but maybe it is a significant factor in your addiction in the first place, is not, it's not a good prescription to get better,
Yeah. No, I completely agree with that. So I want to talk about 12 steps for a couple of minutes, but
I love 12 step.
Now that you kind of touched on trauma also, I heard a video that you talked about just like with regard to kind of getting into your body. I've read a lot I've read Peter Levine and Bessel van der Kolk and a lot of these leading trauma researchers with like somatic experiencing. And you gave this example of you riding a bike for the first time and just having this experience where your body just started weeping like uncontrollably.
I remember it well. Yeah.
And I had that exact same. So Shai, I didn't cry for my first 2 years sober.
Only
not
2
a
years?
single tear, not one single tear. And you know what? I used to think that it was because I was like, now like emotionally strong and emotionally sober or whatever. Because now looking back, I was so. I still am to some degree, but better than so tight,
so tight, man.
Just like a lock, like a, and that process that has been the most uncomfortable for me anyway. I mean, the first year, just in terms of physical withdrawal stuff lasted a while, but that process of like unwrapping so slowly has been this unbelievable experience. And I guess like my question for you is, do you notice that more with opioid addictions, or do you find that people with addictions in general have, these attachment traumas, different developmental traumas, maybe things that happen later that basically freeze them into that? And that, do you believe that has to unwind for this real healing to begin?
So sort of two questions in there. One, is there a difference amongst the substances that people prefer, like is it different from opiate addicts than others? And then the other is, do you think that sort of relaxing into opening up internally in terms of the nervous system needs to happen for people, right? Those are kind of the two questions.
Yeah.
I think about the first one. I think I don't want to answer the first question because even amongst opiate addicts, I see quite a bit of variance in their personality type. And so let's call that rigidity some sort of trauma response, or, maybe even an orientation. You know what I mean? Like, oh, I'm tight, and whatever. But there are even different types of that. There's there's this one, there's this one, there's this one, there's the, what I'm saying? So even people's sort of adaptive posture, towards what they've been through is highly different. So I don't know. I haven't thought about it with opiate addicts or observed it enough to have an answer to that. In terms of whether that's necessary to stay clean, factually, no. I've bumped into incredibly rigid people that have been sober for a long time, to my surprise. But life is a whole hell of a lot better if you can learn how to chill the fuck out and relax and unwind. And in fact, I would say that the journey for that kind of healing is part of the beauty of life and part of the beauty of recovery. And so even beyond like just some technical way of it being better, part of what makes my life meaningful is everybody that comes to this life, as far as I can tell, is broken in one way or another. I mean, I'm using a harsh word, but they're not perfect. They're not completely whole. They've been through something, they've inherited something. And so part of life, and this has become quite popular now, is being on a journey of healing and maintenance and healing and seeking. And so that unwinding that you're talking about is sort of part of our birthright, addicts and non-addicts alike. And so, I just encourage people to get into it, man, to get into it.
Yeah. So let me talk about, from my own personal sense of urgency. Let me just kind of, sure. I would do want to hear like your perspective. So I have two little kids. My kids are 3 and 5. I have a 3-year-old girl and a 5-year-old boy.
Yeah.
So my son is 5, and I told you that I've been sober 5 years. Okay, so my son was a baby as I'm going through this process, and thankfully I have an incredible spouse, which that makes a world of difference. In the beginning, like when I'm leaving, I was leaving at 5:00 p.m. and we would go out to speak at a detox an hour away, and we would hang out for an hour afterwards, and I would get home at 10 p.m. You need to have a partner if there's an infant at home, and that's going to be happening. So, so I am forever grateful.
And a kind giving partner.
A kind giving partner. Yeah, exactly. I mean, she is, she's unbelievable. So if you're listening to this, thank you. But the urgency. So what was different about me getting sober this time versus in 2013 is that I did not feel the urgency to just become well overnight. I did feel that the first time. I really felt there was an urgency to make up for lost time, and I needed to get quote better. Now I did not feel that this time. However, the urgency that I did feel, because I started reading some books about trauma. I read In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, among others, things where it became painfully obvious to me that in terms of sort of passing along these developmental traumas, these sort of intergenerational traumas that get passed along, I used to think that as long as you're sober, you're not at risk of passing that along. And it turns out that that's not true. So I started recognizing all this stuff in myself. Like, for example, the fact that I could not cry for a couple of years, and I'm thinking, I have babies. Like, what are they not getting from me that they need to be getting from their primary caregiver? So that was my sense of urgency, just to talk to people, and so that's where all that stuff comes from, in terms of my personal experience anyway. I didn't know anything about any of that stuff.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I once had a schizophrenic client, and I was sitting with him outside at the old treatment program I used to work at, and he said, I think that this earth is actually just a cosmic hospital. It's where broken souls come to heal. And I thought, wow, man, that's a really cool perspective. You know what I mean? I never forgot that. I was like, like we're definitely, everything's not okay, but we're all trying to make things, okay. We're all trying to, so I can kind of dig that. I think being a parent for me is quite a shameful affair, especially the more like psychological education you have, and the more like I'm a pretty aware person, and so it's like I'm definitely aware of all the things I'm not doing.
Right.
Exactly. And your kids generally don't say, "Hey, you're doing a great job." You know what I mean? I mean, now and then, but it's not often, and so you don't know.
Certainly not a 3-year-old.
my rabbi who I love is a guy named Mordecai Finley. Brilliant dude. He says, the job of a parent is to be a little better than your parents. And I went, okay, I get down with that. You know what I mean? And, not to down my parents, they're amazing. You know what I mean? Clearly. But if that's the yardstick for me, okay, I'm gonna do a little better than that, because this is tough stuff, and we're trying to prepare our kids for a world we don't know, man. I mean, I don't know. Should they have more screen time or less? But everybody's going less screen time. I'm like, unless everybody's going to be uploaded in 40 years, it's like, I don't know what's going to be 20 years from now. What are we even preparing our kids for?
I know. Well, I think of that kind of stuff all the time. I just try to let them. My two big things are just love and safety. I want to be able to express love, and I want them to feel safe all the time. And I have to watch God, because I'm just predisposed to these like rage bursts. That's just kind of been in me like my entire life, and I've really gotten it under control recently. But I know that it's there, and it scares me. And sometimes they, like if they catch me at the wrong place at the wrong time, I almost have to just hide myself into like the corner of the house, because I know that like I'm a time bomb right now, and I don't want these little innocent kids to be the recipient of this.
So much stuff changes with time. It's like as our testosterone goes down, our tempers get better. I mean, I actually think that's like the funniest gimmick in the world, because I would really like the biggest agent of change, like I said, in terms of recovery, but I think it's time.
Yeah.
These things take time to unfold. And so, I definitely can relate to that kind of like rigid frustration or anger. And as I've gotten older, I've gotten more chill. Thank God, I'm not as tight as I was in my 20s.
Yeah. No, it's certainly better. It's certainly better than, like my early 30s. Okay. So we're kind of getting up to like around 12 noon your time. Do you have a little bit more time, or do you have to kind of hop off?
I got like 5 minutes.
Okay. Because I kind of wanted to just talk at least one more topic, I guess.
Sure.
One thing that I was told in treatment, in the beginning, just with the 12-step groups, is that it's all one big spiritual disease. It's all one big spiritual malady.
Question.
And in terms of this podcast being more opiate focused, all right.
Yeah.
I guess that my question for you, and it's possible that this is just a projection of like my own kind of inner stuff, but I almost see that the recovering, folks with opioid addictions, that there is this kind of inner sadness that I don't know that I necessarily always recognize in other people. Again, that could just be me and my own stuff. Do you subscribe to the belief that it's all one big spiritual disease, or do you notice general differences, with the long-term recovery of opioid addictions? And then do you think that like an opioid addicted person should be encouraged to go to AA versus some of the other places?
Sure. So I see like three questions there, and I would kind of reframe them. To me, it being one big spiritual disease is a particular lens, meaning it's looking at the commonalities, not the differences. And there are commonalities, amongst people that are suffering from addiction. People, whether it's opiates or alcohol or crack or, whatever, people say things like, I feel empty. I feel like I don't know who I am. I don't feel like I'm connected to anything meaningful. I can't find any meaning in my life. You know what I mean? So like the list of things you hear are kind of the same. And that kind of sounds like, hey, man, it sounds like a spiritual problem there that we all have. And so I subscribe to that. I think that that's, true from that point of view. Are there different types of people that are attracted to different types of substances? Yeah, for sure. Right. I mean, there's a lot of poets historically that were heroin addicts that love to read and write and who are into, it's kind of like, I don't know, a lot of like artists tended towards heroin. I see similarities between what I call the alcoholic personality, the classic alcoholic personality, the opiate personality, more so than the cocaine personality.
Interesting.
Yeah. Right. The cocaine personality tends to be more impulsive, tends to be, it's called more psychotically organized or anxiously organized in that way. You know what I mean? And so, that's what's interesting about you a little bit. It's sort of like you seem to have some of that stimulant type organization in your personality type. even though you identify strongly as an opiate addict, you know.
The hardest obsession to leave was Adderall, by the way, for me. That was the longest obsession to go away.
Yeah. So, you know, definitely. Anyway, so I mean, somebody could do an interesting study like this, a big 5 personality type test, which I like that. I think it's a good model as to like the different substances, that the different personality types at different percentages. But you see it. I mean, you definitely see it when you're in treatment. You know, not perfectly, but they're different types. And I think some of the hardest to treat are alcoholics and opiate addicts. I mean, real alcoholics are very difficult to treat. Yeah. Really, especially adult real alcoholics are very difficult to treat. And I feel the same way about serious opiate addicts, obviously. With stimulant abusers, I think it's easier to treat if you could get them long enough, get them standing still long enough, and if they haven't burned out too much of, you know, certain parts of their brain that, you know, control emotion regulation and impulse. Yeah. You know, so it's very hard to treat somebody who's been smoking crack for 30 years. You know what I mean? Just because their ability to stop an impulse is severely impaired, you know, but somebody who's been doing cocaine for a while, something, you know, yeah, you know, we can work on that, you know? Yeah. So I think there are differences.
Yeah. That's a really good point. All right. You know, so I'm going to kind of save the other stuff for now.
Yeah.
Shai, thank you so much for your time. This was exactly what I was hoping for. Incredible perspective on, you know, some of the toughest questions that we're being faced with right now. The world is changing, the country is changing, the approach to addiction recovery, like you're talking about, is changing, you know, so we do need to be talking about these topics and not, you know, shying away from them because they're uncomfortable. Before we go, can you tell people where they can find you?
Sure. I don't know my Instagram handle, but the website for my treatment program is recoverintegrity.com. And in the blog section, I have tons and tons of videos. I am on Instagram. Maybe you know, Jeff.
Recover Integrity. Yeah. No.
Oh, so Recover Integrity. Yeah, great.
That's an incredible. It's an incredible. And all those little 3 to 5 minute clips are on the IGTV tab. They're all so good. There's about, I don't know, 50 of them, 30 of them.
Yeah, sure.
I've watched them all. I think everybody should.
Thank you, Jeff. I really appreciate it. This has been super enjoyable for me too. I've enjoyed your presence both here and online. And, you know, I don't really pay attention that much to a lot of the stuff that, you know, is online, but you definitely caught my attention and I appreciated you acknowledging what I was doing. It meant a lot. So thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you. You know, I didn't get to all my questions today, which means that we're setting up for a part 2 in the coming months, maybe. So the listeners can look forward to that. So, all right, Shai, you know, thanks again, and we will talk soon.
Thanks, brother. Take it easy.